Hello, welcome to the 5th episode of the American Years Revisited podcast. I'm Kate Simpson, coordinator of the American Years Project. In this episode, Gerry Pursley shares a first-hand account of active service on the Proteus at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. With no warning, the Proteus left the Holy Loch and headed for the North Atlantic. The ship wasn't quite sea-ready as they left in such a hurry, and this led to all sorts of situations that you'll hear Gerry describe in rich detail. You may hear the odd ringing noise in the background of this episode, for which we apologise, but it absolutely doesn't take anything away from the story. We start with Gerry's wife, Linda, telling us about how she heard that the ship was leaving.
It was just such a shock because I'd just been speaking to Gerry on the phone as we did when he was on the ship and I was ashore, of course, in my house. And everything was fine. And then the next thing I knew was a taxi driver banging on the door and saying, "Is Gerry here?" Because they knew the houses where the Scottish girls were dating Americans. And I said, "No." I said, "Gerry's on the ship tonight." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "The ship's leaving." I said, No, the ship's not leaving. I've just spoken to Gerry. And he said, "No," he says, "the ship is actually leaving." And I ran, our house was down in Kilbride Avenue, I had a great view. And within about 15 minutes, I see this big grey ship just moving very slowly just down the Clyde. And I couldn't believe it. I just could not believe it. I tried to phone him back and beep, because what they were doing, they were running along the deck with axes and they were just chopping every single communication line from the ship. So that nobody could communicate with the ship at that point from the shore here. And it was a terrible shock. And of course, I'm in tears. I'll never see him again. And my poor mother having to cope with this. And it was, how many days was it? 8?
I know it was over a week. Anyway.
It was over a week. And I worked in Glasgow, and every night I'd be coming back home on the ferry. And the first thing I do is look to the Holy Loch. Oh, there's no ship there yet. So it was about 8 days. It was a very,
it's
very
hard to remember
time.
now.
Yeah,
but
I remember.
It seemed like it was a lot longer than probably.
Yeah, it was. And then of course you had got terrible weather, and you had to pull into Tobermory Bay because the weather was so bad. The ship was just bucking like a bronco and heaving and crashing down. So they were actually sheltering in Tobermory Bay, but nobody knew where they were. Obviously, the American Navy knew where they were, but nobody else knew where they were.
Not even sure about that.
No, not even maybe sure about that. But anyway, the day the ship sailed back into the Holy Loch, it was, hallelujah, he's back. Because I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. I thought that might be it, So it was very traumatic at the time.
Gerry, how much were you told by your officers about what was...
Well, every day we got like a plan of the day while we were at sea. And I wish that I had some of those today. They gave a bit of briefing what was going on in Washington, D.C. about the Cuba situation and on a daily thing. And we were notified, in that format. They're only going to tell you what you need to know. But nothing was, it was strictly through chief.
Did you talk to your colleagues about what you thought was happening?
The thing of it was when we were out at sea, we went out, there must have been a force 8, 10 out. And you got to realize this was a ship that was not prepared to go to sea. Those days we had the big gantry cranes out the side. And it caused, would cause a lot of rolling in the ship. They actually were afraid the ship would turn over because of the gantry cranes. For the few times that I'd be brave enough when I was up in my accommodation quarters up there to go and have weren't supposed to go out on deck, but to even open the door enough where you could look out. The waves were right up over the main deck on the ship. You peek out the door and all you could see in front of you or to the side of the ship, you either saw sky or you saw water, and the water would wash right up alongside the door on the deck, on the main deck. That's a pretty big ship. Take a look at it online.
Wow.
And we were out there and it was very rough.
Did you know anything about how tense things were?
Of course. I mean, we were out there. we figured that it hadn't happened yet because we'd probably been one of the first targets. Because our ship, we were to service the submarines, and we were located in this northern quarter. So I mean, the thing of it was, we were a bit like we were written off already. When we were out there, I know that we were out there for about 2 or 3 days, and we're taking poundings. We had the metal shop used to be up above our accommodation quarters, and all the stock, in other words, all the metal stock and everything in the metal shop, pipe shop, all broke loose. And it was just, you would hear it hit the deck, you'd hear it go from one side of the room to the other. It would just be bang, bang, bang. We had in the engine, because I was in the forward engine room, it was so rough that there was only about 3 or 4 out of the whole engine room gang, of which we should have had about a total of 20 or so in that engine room. You didn't see half of them for 10 days. You didn't see them. You couldn't find them. They weren't in their bunks. They were either in a fan room somewhere, sleeping or sick. I stood watches. I'd stand 8-hour watches and 4 off.
This sounds like a nightmare to me.
And it was just a survival exercise,
Yeah.
to be quite honest with you.
And worry, the anxiety about what was happening between America and Russia as well.
We didn't have a clue where we were going, and really we weren't going anywhere. We just got out of the UK waters. And then when we did get up there, after a couple of days of really bad weather and everything, we were in a trough. We weren't headed into the waves, and the captain came on because everybody was worried about this ship. This ship had been cut in half, and this ship had a section put in the middle of it. Rumors came that the captain they don't want to head into the waves. They're afraid it would break in half. So anyway, the captain came on let us know about 7 o'clock at night that at midnight he was going to turn the ship into the waves in order to stabilize the ship, because we were out there just doing rolls back and forth. We in the engine room up on our upper deck, which was above our engines that ran around the engine room. We had a big machine up there that we used for injector, diesel injector repair bench up there. It was so rough that this actually fell. It was dislodged, bigger than a wardrobe, a big machine. It actually came loose and fell over on top of one of the engines.
Oh.
And rather, we couldn't move it. So what we did was we just tied it down where it fell. And we had one engine apart. It was a 16 cylinder engine. We had half of the cylinder heads off of it, which are about as big as half a bathtub as far as size was concerned. And these cylinder heads were lying on the deck plates, and they were sliding all over the place. When the ship would buck up, if it wasn't tied properly, this cylinder head would come sliding down the deck plates towards you. And you just
didn't sound like a state-of-the-art ship.
It sounds like a ship is just getting ready to sink, quite honestly.
What people have to realize is the mothership, was like a huge floating factory.
Yes, it was.
And when I was on the ship in charge of the periscope shop, we were out in the north somewhere, really bad storm. It was shearing off big machines in the machine shop, big lathes and stuff. It was breaking 3/4-inch bolts and these things, and the mess decks was all over. So for them to get underway like that quick, you don't have time to secure for sea, because it took quite a lot to get everything secured to sea, because we were out, like say we pulled into somewhere in Ireland because it was so bad. And I remember we were back on the fantail, me and this guy Joe Burton standing there, and it was like the Poseidon Adventure. This wave coming, you couldn't see the sky. You were thinking sinking is what you're thinking. It was quite frightening.
When that night, when the captain told us we're going to turn into the waves and into the water, what we did was We were on watch. There's about 3-4 of us down in the engine room, standing watch, and we turned into the waves and everything. And we started the old Victory at Sea thing, where the ships go way up. When the ship comes down, it would go, into the water. And this is a big ship. This almost 500-foot ship is beating the bottom of the ship. And then what happened, of course, when the ship went down, the propellers would come out of the water. So the engines would overspeed and trip out. The governors would trip the engines out. And when you hear the engines start to go down, you had to run over and restart the engine real quick. You got to realize we had 4 main engines, but we had one apart. So we had 3 engines running down there, plus our 2 generators for ship's power. It was a nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
It just really was. And like I'm saying, because you're so busy and everything, you don't really think about a whole lot else.
You're not really thinking about the crisis.
No, you're
thinking about the immediate crisis.
You're thinking about survival.
You're thinking about doing what needs to be done. You did is what you get.
How many of you were in this situation?
Well, I guess the whole crew was there, except some that we actually left behind. We did leave. I think it was about 25 or something that didn't make it back to the
They
ship.
didn't know the ship was going to be leaving that night. It was just a very sudden
They couldn't
thing.
get back before we left.
One minute the ship was there, and the next minute the ship was gone.
What would the whole crew have been?
It's hard to say. I really don't know. I always figured there was around 1,200 on there.
That's amazing.
It was a real experience. There's other people that had that same experience still around, I would imagine. But
they took refuge in Tobermory Bay.
Well, we went into Tobermory Bay once it calmed down a bit, but I mean it was still very rough. And we managed to get into Tobermory Bay. First off, we couldn't get a hold with our anchor. We really went in there for some provisions. I don't think we got a thing. I think we just got in there and finally just had to go back out again. And I think we left both of our bow anchors there. But whether we got them back or not, I'm not sure. Like I'm saying, the ship was not ready to go to sea. Even though they were probably talking about it, it probably kind of went over your head a bit. But the whole day before we went out, even the day before, we were told to start the engines to keep the oil warm in case we had to leave. We did that for a bit, and then they put that on hold. And then the next day we had to start again, and we'd have to run our engines.
Did you question the idea of the ship leaving at that time? Or was that explained to you?
We never questioned an order.
No, we never. How do I say it? It's one of these things you didn't think would happen.
Mm-hmm.
But you'd be ready for it.
The idea of the ship leaving in a crisis.
It was as big a surprise to me that it went out as it was to Linda.
Mm-hmm.
And although she would call and I said, yeah, we're having to run our engines to keep the oil warm. Do you think you're going out? I think you asked me that.
I did.
You think you're going out?
I said, no,
I don't think so. But we're just being prepared. But then when it came, it was the decision was made and we were gone.
And how did you know from you thinking, I don't think we're going? What was the process from that to you actually going? How did you get back to the ship? How did you know to go back?
I was on the ship already. I had duty that day. And I'm sure that because we left quite a few people there, and I think the other thing of it was, if I'm not mistaken, they weren't allowing people at that point for a couple of days to go to Greenock. It was you can go off the ship, but you got to stay close when you get back. I know that when I finally got off the ship on the day we got back, I met some guys coming back on the ship at that time. We just got back. But no, the decision, we were, we're going to warm up to keep the engines warm. We're going to go in case we have to go out and this, that, and the other. And then all of a sudden it's, let's go. We're on our way. We're leaving. When we left that night, I think it was about 9:15 or something.
Yeah, because I just spoken to you on the phone and everything you thought was fine.
And what happened was when we left that night, we actually had a submarine tied up to each side of the ship.
Yeah.
We went out past the dry dock with 2 babies with us, 2 submarines with us. I went up to have a look because I was in the engine room at that time. And I couldn't believe that we were leaving and everything. So I went up went up topside just for a quick peek. And I went up there, and I remember going up on the deck, and I could see them on the submarines and everything. And they had working parties on the deck, just throwing like cases of canned goods and stuff onto the submarine decks. And I was on the deck catching provisions and stuff, throwing them down the hatches. And they did that as we went out past Dunoon Pier, and that was us gone. And
all I could see on the shore was the lights just gradually disappearing into the gloom.
But like I say, we were out there for for quite a few days there, and like I say, not knowing, because we were just some sort of limbo at that time. We were just fighting the elements. We would get our plan of the day in the morning with a little bit of a blurb in it and everything. I always thought that somebody somewhere's got some of these, which would have been nice to have kept, And when we came back in, I can't remember what date it was. I remember
mid-October.
By then the seas had calmed a lot, and you could tell when you got into the Firth of Clyde, and the engine slowed down, and we were coming up the Clyde quite quietly, or in the engine room we were, and everything. And I was standing throttle watch then, and by then I've already had a few more guys show up. Ones that had probably by the time the seas got a little bit calmer, some of the guys that had been hiding all the time, they're now showing up. So I was standing throttle watch in the engine room on one of the main engines. I'm standing there watching the gauges and everything, and all of a sudden I get a line of oily water down my face and everything. What had happened was, when the Oil Kings had pumped the ballast out coming up the Clyde, they pumped into the bilges, flooded our engine generators and everything. So we had to shut down before we even got to Dunoon, and we had to go in there with tugs and after engine room, because we lost all our power at that point. And then when we got back the next day, we found out we had a lot of water damage, and we spent the next 3 months on port and starboard duty, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, taking our coils out of our generators so they could take them into the galley and put them in the oven to bake them and get the water out of them. Had to be washed down with fresh water and everything, because the bilges were all full of salt water, and all the generators keep them rusting and everything. So we had a busy time there. So we also, kind of like
really
shooting yourself in the foot when you're already injured,
That's amazing memoir of that experience, Gerry.
I remember it quite vividly, what parts that I played part in. But when you go to asking about what was happening up on the upper decks, I have no idea. I was not really cut out for going to sea after that.
That was Gerry Pursley's account of the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis while serving on the Proteus. Thank you, Gerry, for bringing that moment to life in such detail. You have been listening to the American Years Revisited podcast. For more information and for further episodes, please visit our website on americanyearsrevisited.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.